June 22, 1941, 4:0 a.m. The telephone rang in Chequers, Winston Churchill's country residence. The Prime Minister had left explicit instructions. He was not to be disturbed unless the news was of the utmost importance. His private secretary, John Colville, picked up the receiver and listened. Then he went upstairs immediately. Churchill was asleep. He had been working until past midnight, as he did most nights, coordinating Britain's war effort, reading intelligence reports, dictating correspondence. He was 66 years old, carrying the weight of a nation that had been fighting alone against Nazi Germany for over a year. Sleep, when he got it, was precious. Colville knocked on the door, entered when Churchill called out, "Prime Minister, German forces have invaded the Soviet Union. Massive attack across the entire Eastern Front. Began approximately 4 hours ago." Churchill sat up immediately. The sleep fell away from him. He had been expecting this. British intelligence had been tracking German troop movements toward the Soviet border for weeks. Churchill himself had tried to warn Stalin, sending messages through diplomatic channels that a German attack was imminent. Stalin had ignored the warnings, convinced they were British tricks trying to provoke war between Germany and the Soviet Union. But Churchill knew Hitler, knew his patterns, his obsessions, his strategic thinking. Hitler would never be satisfied with Western Europe. He had always wanted Lebensraum, living space in the East. The invasion of Russia had been inevitable. The only question was when. Now it had happened. At this moment, as Churchill sat in his bedroom at Chequers, 3 million German soldiers were driving into Soviet territory, the largest invasion force in history. Panzer divisions racing across the frontier, Luftwaffe bombers pounding Soviet airfields, infantry advancing in massive columns. Churchill asked questions. What do we know? Where are the attacks? How are the Soviets responding? Colville gave him what information they had, still fragmentary at this hour. But the scale was clear. This wasn't a border skirmish. This was total war. Germany had committed virtually its entire military power to destroying the Soviet Union. Churchill got out of bed. He would not sleep again that day. There was too much to consider, too many implications to work through. He told Colville to summon his military chiefs, his cabinet secretaries. They would meet that afternoon. There were decisions to make, decisions that would define Britain's strategy for the rest of the war. But first, Churchill needed to think. He dressed and went downstairs to his study. The morning sun was rising over the Buckinghamshire countryside. A beautiful English summer day. Across Europe, men were dying by the thousands. Churchill's relationship with the Soviet Union was complicated. He had been one of communism's most vocal critics for decades. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, he had advocated military intervention to strangle Bolshevism in its cradle. He had called communism a plague, a cancer, a threat to civilization itself. In 1939, when Stalin signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler, dividing Poland between them, Churchill had condemned it as a cynical partnership between two totalitarian regimes. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the Winter War of 1939–40, Churchill had supported the Finns, had advocated sending military aid to help them resist Soviet aggression. Churchill hated communism, hated what it had done to Russia, hated its ideology, its methods, its contempt for individual freedom. He had been fighting against communist influence in British politics for his entire career. But Churchill understood something that transcended ideology. Hitler was the immediate threat. Hitler had conquered most of Europe. Hitler's armies occupied France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria. Hitler's air force had bombed British cities. Hitler's submarines were sinking British ships. Hitler represented an existential threat to Britain's survival. The Soviet Union, whatever Churchill thought of its political system, was now fighting the same enemy. And that changed everything. He sat in his study, smoking his first cigar of the day, thinking through the implications. His staff knew better than to interrupt when the Prime Minister was working through a problem. They could see it in his face, the concentration, the way he seemed to look through walls into distances only he could see. The strategic calculation was straightforward. Every German soldier fighting in Russia was a German soldier not fighting Britain. Every tank, every aircraft, every artillery piece committed to the Eastern Front was one less weapon threatening British positions in North Africa or the Mediterranean. If Germany was going to exhaust itself invading Russia, that served British interests perfectly. But there was a deeper question, a moral question. Could Churchill, the lifelong anti-communist, ally himself with Stalin? Could he ask the British people, who had been taught to fear and distrust the Soviet Union, to support the regime that had signed a pact with Hitler, that had invaded Poland from the east while Germany invaded from the west? Churchill knew what his critics would say. Some in his own Conservative Party detested the Soviet Union even more than they feared Germany. They would argue that Britain should stand aside, let Hitler and Stalin destroy each other, pick up the pieces afterward. But Churchill rejected that calculation immediately. He understood what some of his colleagues did not. If Germany defeated the Soviet Union, if Hitler conquered Russia and seized its vast resources, its oil fields, its grain, its industrial capacity, Britain would face an enemy of unimaginable power. An enemy that controlled all of Europe and European Russia. An enemy that could bring overwhelming force to bear against Britain's remaining positions. No, Britain needed the Soviet Union to survive. Needed Stalin's armies to bleed the Wehrmacht, to tie down German divisions, to prevent Hitler from concentrating all his power against Britain. That afternoon, Churchill's cabinet met in emergency session. The discussion went exactly as Churchill had anticipated. Some ministers expressed hope that Germany and the Soviet Union would exhaust each other. Others worried about the implications of allying with Stalin. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden raised practical questions. What support could Britain offer the Soviets? What would Stalin expect in return? Churchill let them talk. He listened to the arguments, the concerns, the strategic assessments. Then he spoke, and when Churchill spoke in cabinet, the room fell silent. "I have only one purpose," he said. "The destruction of Hitler. Nothing will turn me from this purpose. Nothing." He looked around the table, meeting each minister's eyes. "If Hitler invaded hell," Churchill continued, "I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The line would become famous. Churchill would use it again that evening in a broadcast to the nation. But in this cabinet room, it served a specific purpose. It told his ministers exactly where Churchill stood. Ideology was secondary. The alliance with Stalin was necessary, and Britain would commit to it fully. Churchill explained his reasoning. "We have but one aim and one single, irrevocable purpose. We are resolved to destroy Hitler and every vestige of the Nazi regime. From this, nothing will turn us. Nothing. We will never parley. We will never negotiate with Hitler or any of his gang. Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. Any man or state who marches with Hitler is our foe." It was pure Churchill. Absolute moral clarity combined with ruthless pragmatism. Hitler was evil. Anyone fighting Hitler was, in that moment, Britain's ally. The political system of that ally was irrelevant to the immediate task. The cabinet approved Churchill's position, not unanimously. Some ministers remained uncomfortable. But Churchill had the authority, the force of personality, to drive the decision through. That evening, Churchill broadcast to the nation. He had been refining his speech all day, working through multiple drafts, testing phrases, building the argument he would present to the British people. At 9:00 p.m., he sat before the BBC microphone in his study. The broadcast would reach millions across Britain and the world. It was Churchill's moment to define Britain's response to this new phase of the war. He began by acknowledging his own history with communism. The Nazi regime is indistinguishable from the worst features of communism. It is devoid of all theme and principle except appetite and racial domination. No one has been a more consistent opponent of communism than I have for the last 25 years. I will unsay no word that I have spoken about it. Churchill was establishing credibility, telling his listeners that he had not suddenly become a communist sympathizer. His opposition to Soviet ideology remained unchanged. But all this fades away before the spectacle which is now unfolding. The past with its crimes, its follies, and its tragedies flashes away. Then came the description of what was happening in Russia at that very moment. Churchill painted a picture for his listeners, made them see it. I see the Russian soldiers standing on the threshold of their native land, guarding the fields which their fathers have tilled from time immemorial. I see them guarding their homes where mothers and wives pray. I see the 10,000 villages of Russia where the means of existence is wrung so hardly from the soil, but where there are still primordial human joys, where maidens laugh and children play. It was masterful. Churchill was humanizing the Soviet people, making them real to British listeners. Not communist abstractions, but farmers and mothers and children. People defending their homes against invasion. I see advancing upon all this in hideous onslaught the Nazi war machine, with its clanking, heel-clicking, dandified Prussian officers, its crafty expert, agents fresh from the cowing and tying down of a dozen countries. I see also the dull, drilled, docile, brutish masses of the Hun soldiery, plodding on like a swarm of crawling locusts. The language was vivid, almost Shakespearean. Churchill understood that radio required imagery, required listeners to see what he was describing. He gave them Nazis as insects, as a plague descending on innocent villages. Then came the strategic explanation. Why Britain would support the Soviet Union. The Russian danger is therefore our danger, and the danger of the United States, just as the cause of any Russian fighting for his hearth and home, is the cause of free men and free peoples in every quarter of the globe. Churchill was building a coalition in language. Britain, America, Russia, all fighting the same enemy, all with a common interest in Hitler's defeat. But he made one thing absolutely clear. Britain's support for the Soviet Union did not mean Britain had changed its view of communism. We have offered the government of Soviet Russia any technical or economic assistance which is in our power and which is likely to be of service to them. We shall appeal to all our friends and allies in every part of the world to take the same course and pursue it as we shall, faithfully and steadfastly to the end. Then the famous line, the one he had used in cabinet, the one that would define Churchill's position. This is no class war, but a war in which the whole British Empire and Commonwealth of Nations is engaged without distinction of race, creed, or party. It is not for me to speak of the action of the United States, but this I will say. If Hitler imagines that his attack on Soviet Russia will cause the slightest division of aims or slackening of effort in the great democracies who are resolved upon his doom, he is woefully mistaken. Churchill was sending a message to Hitler. This invasion would not divide the Allies, would not cause Britain to step back and let Germany and Russia fight it out. Britain would support Russia because supporting Russia meant fighting Hitler. Any man or state who fights on against Nazism will have our aid. Any man or state who marches with Hitler is our foe. This applies not only to organized states, but to all representatives of that vile race of quislings who make themselves the tools and agents of the Nazi regime against their fellow countrymen and the lands of their birth. The broadcast lasted 22 minutes. When Churchill finished, he sat back in his chair, exhausted. He had made Britain's position clear, had committed the nation to supporting the Soviet Union, had asked the British people to set aside decades of anti-communist sentiment and see the Soviet Union as an ally in the fight against Hitler. The reaction was mixed. Most Britons accepted Churchill's logic. Hitler was the immediate enemy. If the Russians were fighting Hitler, then Britain should help them. But there were critics. Conservative members of Parliament expressed concern. Some newspapers questioned the wisdom of allying with Stalin. Churchill ignored them. He had made his decision based on strategic necessity, and that decision would shape the rest of the war. In the weeks that followed, Britain began sending aid to the Soviet Union. Convoys would sail from Britain to Murmansk and Archangel, ports in northern Russia, carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, supplies. The Arctic convoys would become some of the most dangerous missions of the war. German submarines and aircraft would attack them relentlessly. Many ships would be lost. Many sailors would die in the freezing Arctic waters. But the aid would flow, because Churchill had committed Britain to keeping the Soviet Union in the fight. And keeping the Soviet Union in the fight meant keeping German armies tied down in the east, bleeding German strength, buying time for Britain to build up its forces, waiting for America to enter the war. Churchill understood something that would prove true over the next 4 years. The Eastern Front would be decisive. The massive battles between German and Soviet forces, Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad, the drive to Berlin, these would be where Germany's military power was destroyed. Soviet casualties would exceed 20 million, military and civilian. The scale of the Eastern Front dwarfed everything happening in North Africa or Italy or even in France after D-Day. Britain's contribution to the Soviet war effort was relatively small compared to what the Soviets themselves would sacrifice. But it mattered. The convoys kept Soviet factories supplied with raw materials. British intelligence shared information about German movements and plans. And perhaps most importantly, Britain's commitment to the Soviet alliance prevented Stalin from ever seriously considering a separate peace with Hitler. Churchill had been right. On June 22, 1941, when he learned of the German invasion, he had seen immediately what needed to be done. Set aside ideological differences. Focus on the immediate threat. Support anyone fighting against Hitler. It was pragmatic. It was ruthless. It was exactly what Britain needed. In his study at Chequers that morning, as dawn broke over England, Churchill had made a calculation. The enemy of my enemy is my ally, not a permanent ally perhaps, not an ideological ally, but an ally in this moment against this threat. And that was enough. The war would last another 4 years. The alliance with the Soviet Union would hold until Germany's defeat in May 1945. Then, almost immediately, the Cold War would begin. Churchill himself would warn of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe, dividing communist East from democratic West. But in June 1941, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Hitler had made a catastrophic mistake. He had opened a second front, had committed his armies to the vast spaces of Russia. And Churchill, seeing this, had immediately moved to ensure that Britain would do everything possible to keep the Soviet Union fighting. When I learned of the invasion, Churchill would say later, I knew that Hitler had lost the war. He simply didn't know it yet. It was classic Churchill, confidence bordering on certainty, the ability to see the strategic picture clearly even in the chaos of unfolding events. That broadcast on June 22, 1941, defined Churchill's approach to the war. Moral clarity about the evil of Nazism. Ruthless pragmatism about building the coalition needed to defeat it. And absolute determination to see it through to the end. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. It was more than a clever line. It was a statement of purpose. Churchill would work with anyone, ally with anyone, support anyone who was fighting against Hitler. The ideology of that ally was secondary to the primary goal: destroy the Nazi regime, free Europe from Hitler's tyranny, win the war. And on June 22, 1941, when Hitler invaded Russia, Churchill saw immediately that this was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It would take 4 brutal years to reach that end. Millions would die. Cities would be destroyed. Europe would be devastated. But from that moment, the outcome was determined. Germany could not win a two-front war against Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually the United States. The mathematics of industrial production, of manpower, of resources, all favored the Allies once the coalition was fully formed. Churchill understood this that morning at Chequers, understood it when he spoke to his cabinet that afternoon, understood it when he broadcast to the nation that evening. The Soviet Union would suffer terribly, would lose more people than any other nation in the war, but the Soviet Union would survive. And surviving meant tying down German armies that otherwise would have been used against Britain. It was cold strategic calculation wrapped in eloquent rhetoric. Churchill at his best. seeing clearly what needed to be done and having the courage to do it, regardless of political cost. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every like helps us share these forgotten moments when leaders made decisions that changed history. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. These moments matter. The words spoken in them shape the world we live in today. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in Britain, Russia, America? Our community stretches across the world. You're part of keeping these memories alive, making sure we remember not just the battles, but the moments when leaders chose the hard right path over the easy wrong one. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for understanding that sometimes history turns on a single decision made in a study at dawn, when the world is still sleeping and the weight of nations rests on one person's shoulders. Churchill carried that weight, made the decision, committed Britain to the alliance that would win the war. When I see the Russian soldiers standing on the threshold of their native land, he had said, I see them guarding their homes. He had made the Soviet people real to British listeners, had asked them to see past ideology to the human reality of people defending their homes against invasion. And Britain had answered, had sent the convoys, had provided the aid, had kept faith with the alliance even when it was difficult, even when critics complained, even when the cost was high. Because Churchill had seen clearly on June 22, 1941, what needed to be done, and had the courage to do it. That's leadership. Not in the abstract, but in the specific moment when history demands a decision and the leader makes it. Churchill made it, and in doing so helped win the war.